Welcome to a new daily top AskReddit video. Today's topic:
what dark part of history isn't talked about enough? The 2nd century decline that basically set in motion the fall of the Roman Empire, but also set the groundwork for the challenges faced by the Parthian Empire, Persia, the Han Dynasty, China, the Gupta Empire, India, and the Kushan Empire, Central Asia. Basically the whole civilized world started to fall and forever change course during that era. Edit, for the people responding with, "Don't you mean 3rd century?" I wanted to add that I consider the 2nd century decline starting with the Antonine Plague in 165 AD. Correct me if I'm wrong though. I consider this the starting point because it not only decimated a good portion of the Roman population but also because it heavily affected the Middle Eastern realms such as the Parthians. It seems to me at least to go downhill from this point onwards for most empires at the time, even if the plague had nothing to do with it. Of course, pinpointing an exact start for anything with a global mindset is hard, as not all places went through the same things everywhere and at the same time. For instance, the questioners have a valid point, as it is often called the 3rd century crisis, not the 2nd century decline. But I think the 3rd century crisis focuses only on the Roman Empire. Anyhows, it's a very interesting topic. Cheers everyone. Does anyone have any recommendations for good books on this topic? I'm not a historian of that era. Records of the Grand Historian discuss the Han Dynasty, which I believe was 2nd century. The Gupta Empire is another good one, though those center political dynasties rather than the theme of decline. Edit, Tom Holland book is about Roman Republic fall. Deleted as it's not pertinent. Fall of Civilizations by Paul Cooper. You can listen to his podcasts for free on Spotify as well. His work is brilliant. In Switzerland, we used to sell orphan children to farmers where they had to do hard work. It was basically slavery and lasted until the 1970s. Similar stuff happened in Germany and Sweden as well. America too. That's how our child welfare system started. It's also why we use the phrase, put up, for adoption. The put up part comes from when they used to put the children on the auction block. I learned this from Dorothy Roberts' book, Torn Apart. Also, not all these children were orphans. Babe Ruth's parents had enough of him when he was 7 years old and sent him to an orphanage. Apparently it wasn't unusual back then to just dump your kids if you didn't have time or money for them. My grandpa was one of them. They weren't necessarily orphans, but often just from poor families who couldn't feed their children because of the economical situation. Grandpa was the only of 6 kids who couldn't grow up with his parents. While he had a relatively good living situation, it did mark him for life, and it often resurfaced in his last year when he got dementia. How the Japanese treated anyone not Japanese. China, POWs, Pacific Islanders etc. The Asian world is very aware of it, but it's almost glossed over in many parts of the West. That being said, Nazi Germany is seen with the same fascination and mystique as Western weeaboos view Japan, and the Holocaust isn't talked about as much. As much as we may not like it, it's all about relevancy. I mean, the Rwandan genocide and Pol Pot's regime hold much less impact in both the West and East Asia compared to the above. For context, even as a Chinese American whose grandparents were tortured by the Japanese, I feel a more visceral revulsion towards Imperial Japan than to Nazi Germany, despite recognizing that both were racist, genocidal regimes. One big difference is the Holocaust is extensively taught in German education, while the Japanese think the rape of Nanking is anti-Japanese propaganda. The year 536 is considered the worst in history. There were a series of volcanic eruptions that blocked the sun that caused famine and droughts. The bubonic plague also started to take hold this year, which took out 1/3 of the human population in Europe. Worst in history so far. I appreciate your optimism. I think you are referring to the Justinianic plague. Bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, happened around 800 years later. The Justinianic plague was horrible too, don't get me wrong, as it killed around half of Earth's population. Edit, correction, it killed 25 to 60% of Europe's population, not half of Earth's population. Constantinople had losses about 20% though there's no real record of it since a lot of people died, so the numbers can be higher. Nowhere near half the Earth's population, potentially up to a quarter of the Mediterranean population and perhaps as high as 40% in Constantinople specifically, but it didn't kill half of all people. There are some scholars that believe the mortality rate was even lower than these numbers. Not to say the Justinianic plague wasn't horrible, but there's no need to be hyperbolic. King Leopold II of Belgium should be remembered on the same level as Hitler and Stalin, and I really don't understand why he isn't. Because he committed his atrocities in Africa. If I recall my high school history, didn't the Belgians in Africa find the statistic of how many times a person could be whipped before death? The whip being a she-cot. Before Hitler he was the figurative Hitler. Anyone who really wants to understand just how fucked up King Leopold II was, the atrocities he knowingly committed and the lasting impact he's had on the Congo should read The Ghost of King Leopold by Adam Hochschild. But be warned, it is not a light read. Didn't he reduce the population of the Congo by like 50%? Mediterranean galley slavery seems like something an edgy grim dark author cooked up, yet it was the economic backbone for the Italian kingdoms, Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Yeah, slavery is an ongoing atrocity for thousands of years, essentially treating a human being as an animal or a machine. A lot of the stuff that we consider nice requires a lot of time, energy input to concentrate raw materials and move them around. If you pay full price for the effort involved, it isn't nice anymore, but apparently people can fool themselves that it's okay if the ones who do the work aren't fully human and don't need to be paid. Then it's nice again. Actually, I think it just originated in captured prisoners of war. Instead of carrying the wounded, make the captured prisoners do it. If you need anything else done, they can do that as well. The labor wars in the USA. Child labor laws, 5-day work weeks, safe working conditions, all bought with the blood of grandparents and great-grands. This needs to be taught, but AFIK is glossed over. History doesn't repeat, but rhymes. And here we are again. Similarly, women won for themselves the right to vote only after decades of organized and protracted effort, up to and including bombings and acid attacks. Modern women could gain a lot of much-needed perspective if this were more widely known and taught. Especially the Coal Wars, or, that time, the late 19th and early 20th century equivalents of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk had people murdered in the streets and went to actual, machine-gun-wielding war with their own employees. The Boeing whistleblower murders aren't a funny meme, they're corporate finally going mask off. Again, bro, American schools don't even teach you to read and write. Literacy rates are in the dumpster. How they gonna teach people if they can't even read? One dark part of history that isn't talked about enough is the Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium. From the late 1800s to early 1900s, millions of Congolese people were enslaved, mutilated, and killed in the pursuit of rubber and ivory. The atrocities included cutting off hands as punishment and forcing entire villages into brutal labor. Estimates suggest up to 10 million people died, yet this genocide is rarely taught in schools or discussed widely compared to other historical tragedies. It's a haunting reminder of the devastating impact of unchecked colonial exploitation. TBF, the cruelty was so extreme it doesn't seem like it was even about money anymore. Cutting off a hand won't make someone more productive. It seems like it's just exerting power for the sake of it. There is a photo around somewhere that shows a man looking down at the severed hand of his daughter. They cut off his, I believe it was a 5-year-old, daughter's hand so he would meet his quota going forward. My grandfather lived in eastern Poland in the 50s and has several stories about this, actually. By then, any captured German hideaway would face no legal punishment, but it was well understood that if they were caught, the people would punish them, and as long as it was non-deadly and not too obvious, the authorities would look the other way. Where he lived, at least, the attempts to find non-deadly but horrible punishments that don't leave a mark got pretty nasty. In particular, there were several who got caught, over the course of years, who were punished by being taken to a horse stable, being forced to stick their nose up to the horse's ass, practically touching it, and being tied up in that position all night, often for 7 to 10 days with breaks during the daytime. My grandpa was a rancher, and on about 4 to 5 occasions they asked to use one of his horses for the person, so he got a first-hand view. He said it was quite horrific to say the least, but he didn't feel too bad for them. Wouldn't that risk the horse kicking the Nazi and killing him? Or no? Nope. Raised platform behind the horse for them to lay on, prevents kicking and makes it easier to secure their face to the horse's rump. Horse was kept in one of those breeding stalls, narrow to keep it still, so there wasn't any getting away from it for the night for the German. They changed horses each night too, to not make it too burdensome on any one horse. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was pretty fucked up. African American men were told they would get free treatment, but instead were left untreated. Scientists could study the progression of untreated syphilis. Kids died, all the time. In addition to 40% of babies dying during birth, compared to 0.5% today, only about 1/2 of children who survived birth would survive past the age of 10. If you're keeping score, only about 1/5 pregnancies carried to term resulted in an adult. Globally, only 20% of people made it to adulthood. Today, globally, 77% of people survived to adulthood. Kids died, all the time. All the anti-vax and anti-medicine idiots saying that things were better before vaccines and antibiotics. Maybe they're upset about living past the age of 10. The enslavement of 1.5 million Europeans in North Africa in the 16th century. Hence the word Slav. Can you elaborate a bit or give me a hint where I can read more about what you mean? I'm European and I did not even know this. Till. Even Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, was enslaved by some Tunisian pirates for 5 years, and that's why the world masterpiece is an ode to freedom. Unit 731. If you know, you know. If you don't know, I'd think twice about looking it up. It was a Japanese experimental facility where their subjects were seen as logs rather than humans. Had some seriously messed up experiments which included infecting people with STDs and getting them to infect the other subjects, whether consensual or not. Honestly, it gets into way too much gruesome crap to say on here, so if you're really curious, look it up, but be warned, it's really messed up. Seriously though, I never hear anyone talk about it. Like we're just gonna sweep that under the rug and forget about it, huh? Only happened like 100 years ago, so it's not too far back in history, 1937 to 1945. Unit 731 would take Chinese POWs and weigh them, put them into what was essentially a large convection oven. They would proceed to turn them into human jerky, then weigh them after. This is how we found out the human body is 70% water. It's also how we know most of what we know about hypothermia. They captured locals and left them outside in winter for days, recording the results in fine detail. I went to the museum in winter a few years back. It's around -40°C at night. They bombed the facility at the end of World War II to hide their crimes, and sold their experimental data to the Americans to avoid prosecution at the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. Pensive face. You can see docs, and probably even a movie or two, about this on YouTube. Very bleak.